Hey everybody, Jessica Norwood here, one of the sociology faculty members. I'm going to be talking to you about conflict theory, which is one of our three major theoretical frameworks in sociology. I do want to advise you to watch Carol Hodgson's video about structural functionalism first, primarily because she discusses the concept of social institutions, which are important for conflict theory. And I'll also reference functionalism in this video, so it'd be helpful for you to see that one first. But once you've watched it, we'll talk about it. So here's conflict theory. So the heart of conflict theory says that society is composed of groups in conflict for scarce resources, and these resources are money, power, and ownership. So those with the most money and the most power and the most ownership are able to kind of wield control over the people and groups who have less resources. So this originally came about out of Karl Marx's theory about class conflict. So he was observing the relationship between workers, who are the proletariat, and the owners, the bourgeoisie. And he was seeing that the proletariat, the workers who were working long days and long weeks, were not being paid very much for their labor. And at the same time, the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class were making vast amounts of money and growing their wealth exponentially compared to what the working class was making. And so he said essentially that the workers were being exploited because they were not being fairly compensated for their work. So that saying, the boss makes a dollar while I make a dime, is kind of related to this idea. He went on to say that eventually the proletariat would become so fed up with it that they would eventually actually overthrow the capitalist class. But essentially, he was concerned that they were being exploited, and that was that's the central component of conflict theory, is this concept of exploitation, that someone is being taken advantage of. Since Marx's theory, this has expanded to include different critical perspectives. So feminist theory is part of conflict theory. So we can trace history. We know that men have held institutional power. So men have held the most money, the most political power, and then the ownership. In fact, if you did not know it, women weren't legally allowed to own a lot of things until the 1970s, which really wasn't that long ago, with second wave feminism. So men have institutionally held the power across history, and that has come at the expense of women. So if you look at the makeup of our government, primarily about 80% men, the history of our presidents, who have all been men. You can look at leadership roles in public and private sectors, if you've ever heard of the glass ceiling. These things are all related to power, and women just have not held it at the same rate as men because men have been able to control women's opportunities for a long time. We also see critical race theory. Again, historically, we can trace the power of white people as a group over minoritized racial groups. So we can look at America's legacy of slavery through Jim Crow laws and segregation, redlining, and then even into the issues today that we see as part of race inequality. We refer to inequality in conflict theory as stratification. So stratification literally means layered, so different layers. Society has these different layers, according to conflict theorists, which form a hierarchy. And those at the top of the hierarchy have the most money, power, and ownership, and those at the bottom do not. And those people at the top of the hierarchy are able to control society in their favor to maintain their money, power, and ownership. So those are the big parts of conflict theory. You can see the little pictures across the screen here. Up here we have a protest sign from the Occupy Wall Street movement around like 2008, 2010. These were people who went and literally camped out on Wall Street in New York City, and they protested wealth inequality. Over here you can see again, this is Marx's kind of interpretation of the owners and the workers. So the owner here is saying, this machinery is very productive and I own it. That's why I'm rich. And then the workers are saying, but you didn't build it and you don't operate it. And you don't seem to do much work at all. So this goes back to this guy. He is actually the one in power, whereas these people feel like they're not being given a fair share. Again, this theory is about inequality. And this puzzle piece kind of looks weird over here. This puzzle looks weird, but this is to symbolize that this is a macro theory. So hopefully you read, or you will read in chapter 1, the difference between macro and micro theories. Macro theories look at big social processes across society, and these things called institutions. So if you're thinking, well, men don't have control because my mom makes the most money and she controls our finances and she bosses my dad around all the time. While that can absolutely be true in your house, if you think historically and across institutions, looking through that perspective, men have been the ones to hold the power. So again, this is not a micro theory that looks at these individual things. This is a macro theory that looks at large scale patterns. So let's think about a social problem from a conflict theory perspective. So poverty. So there are micro explanations for poverty. Of course, someone can have maybe an addiction that keeps them in poverty. Someone may have been kicked out of their house because of an interpersonal issue with maybe their parents. Someone might just not want to work and not have the motivation to do anything, and they can live in poverty for that reason. But again, this is not the point of conflict theory. Conflict theory is a different lens. Conflict theory is going to look at bigger social structures that can hold down even people trying their very best to get out of poverty. So one example of this are bank fees. So banks like you if you have a lot of money. If you have a lot of money in your account, they can invest that money and make money off of it. So if you don't have a lot of money in your account, they might actually charge you for your account, so maybe $25 a month, that they don't charge people with more money. And you can see how if you're living in poverty, $25 can make a huge difference. And if you add that up across the years, it makes an even bigger difference. Another fee could be overdraft fees. So people who overdraw their bank accounts can get charged $30 per transaction. And again, people who have more money are not going to be faced with this, and that creates an additional monetary barrier for people in poverty. The minimum wage is another structural issue. So as an individual, I don't really have control over what the minimum wage is, which is still $7.25 federally. That our data show that that's just not enough in this economy to even afford like a one-bedroom apartment. So people trying to escape poverty and working for little wages, even things like $11 an hour, can be very hard. That's a structural issue. You have very little power to negotiate your starting salary, especially if you are a low-income worker. It's kind of a take it or leave it thing a lot of the times. Public transit, well, is a great thing for people who live in poverty because they don't have to pay, a car payment or car insurance or gas. It saves them money that way. But a way this turns into a structural issue is they are time suckers. So think about the amount of time you would spend waiting on a bus, taking the bus, versus just driving your car. So these issues with public transit can actually suck a lot of time out of people who live in poverty who could use that time to build a second skill or get a second job. And then another issue are these things called food deserts, which are places that don't have grocery stores. So if there's not a grocery store in your area and you have to shop at a convenience store, it can be a lot more expensive. So that additional expense, again, is a structural issue because we don't have individual control over where grocery stores decide to build stores. So these are examples of structural issues that conflict theorists would point out are put in place to purposefully take advantage of those in poverty and to kind of keep them in their place. You can contrast this to a functionalist interpretation of poverty. So a functionalist is going to say, well, it might sound bad, but poverty is actually functional for society. It serves a purpose. So one of these purposes might be recycling. People with more funds or more resources are able to donate their stuff to Goodwill. People who live in poverty can buy it from Goodwill, and it lowers the environmental footprint. That's good for society. It helps people who are wealthy. They can hire people to do the work they don't want to do, or they can work jobs that other people wouldn't want to do. That's good for society. It creates industries. Um, Poor people are more likely to use the pawn shop or payday loans to get out of a pinch. These are multi-million-dollar industries that make some people very, very wealthy. Poverty even can create art. Art is often born out of struggle, which is a cultural component. So although conflict theorists see poverty as something to be eradicated and as an inequality that needs to be fixed, functionalists are going to say, well, I mean, you can't argue that these things aren't functional because they do serve a purpose. So you can see the way that these two theories kind of have competing perspectives sometimes. So let's think about the purpose of education from a conflict theory perspective. So if you think as a structural functionalist, the purpose of education is to prepare people to work in society, right? So we want the best people and the best jobs so they can best help our society. But a conflict theorist is going to pull out the inequalities of our education system. And some of these things are schools in poor areas receive less funding and less qualified teachers. We know that these standardized tests that we tend to worship, 80% of achievement on those can be attributed to social economic status. We know that most students actually die in the same class that they were born in. We know that elite colleges like Ivy League schools enroll predominantly upper class students. And we know that the curriculum is determined by the government in public schools, and they have political power. So a conflict theorist is going to look at these things and they're going to say, well, actually, the purpose of education is to preserve the ruling class's power and to maintain social inequality. They're going to say the education system is built in a way that people can't get ahead. And again, you might be saying, well, why am I in college anyway if it doesn't work? Remember, your personal anecdote does not negate the data. I am somebody who was able to transcend my social class because I got a lot of education. But if we look at a big pattern, unfortunately, a lot of people do not transcend or go above their social class that they were born into. We can also look at health and medicine as a social institution. So a structural functionalist would say, you know, health and medicine is there to help us get well and make us healthy. And there might be some unintended consequences of that called latent functions, but in general, we need it as a social institution to keep us healthy. A conflict theorist is going to say, well, yes, but there's still social inequality built into this institution. So we can think about the cost of healthcare. People who make more money have better healthcare than people who don't make as much. You can think about resource hoarding. If you remember at the start of the pandemic, there was some uproar about wealthy people being able to get coronavirus tests before a lot of other people. Or you can think about, you know, whole NBA teams being tested before like sick people. So that would be something conflict theorists would point out, that people who run health and medicine run it in a way that disproportionately advantage the wealthy. And the last comment I want to make is that if you've watched all three videos, you might see that they were all founded by white men. That's not a coincidence. That's kind of purposefully designed. The history of sociology is actually a good example of conflict theory. At the beginning of sociology, women and people of color were not allowed to be theorists or work in the discipline. So we're missing the voices of women and people of color who were not invited into the academy much later. So be sure to read in your textbook about the contributions from people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Jane Addams. Okay, so that's conflict theory. Be sure to ask your instructor if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.